The Liberty Weekly podcast is brought to you by Tom Wood's Liberty Classroom. Sick of losing arguments with your statist friends? Fear no more. Now you can vanquish your intellectual foes with courses taught by top libertarian professors. Tool your intellectual arsenal and enroll today by navigating to www.libertyweekly.net/Liberty Classroom or by following the link in the show notes page.
Domesticated species is one which has been tamed by another species. Well, until we get an invasion from Mars, we shall not be tamed by another species. All we can do is to try to tame ourselves, that an oligarchy tries to tame ourselves, but the oligarchy still remains wild. I mean, however much it succeeded in domesticating the rest of the race, it must remain wild, and this was the part of the fable, the dramatic part of the fable of Brave New World, is that the people in the upper hierarchy, who were not ruthlessly conditioned, could break down. And Charles Darwin insists that because man is wild, he can never expect to domesticate himself, because the people on top will always be undomesticated and will sooner or later always run wild. But I think there's a good deal to be said for this point of view in regard to the permanence of any dictatorship.
I'm worried about a relationship that seems to exist between cost, consent, and control. If a government wants to control its people, of course the job will be easier if they are more willing to consent, and the job will be correspondingly more costly if the corresponding consent isn't there. Could you make a few remarks about the economic feasibility of introducing biological controls of the sort you talk about?
I don't know. I mean, wouldn't it, I would have thought in some ways it would be cheaper than maintaining very large security forces and concentration camps and so on. Just as in asylums, chemical control is a great deal simpler and cheaper than physical control. I mean, the bad old days of straight jackets and manacles and so on required quite a lot of people to handle the insane, whereas the tranquilizers seem to require much fewer. I mean, that you can get equal results with simpler and certainly pleasanter means.
Hello, and welcome back to another installment of Thoughtcrime Thursdays on the Liberty Weekly podcast. As always, I'm your host, Patrick McFarlane. Alright everyone, it's been a while since I've done a Thoughtcrime Thursdays episode. Some would say too long, and many of you might be like, Patrick, it's Sunday today. Yeah, well, school was busy this week, and I don't have another episode written. So, Thoughtcrime Sundays, I guess? But anyways, to keep one of our premier programs alive, I'm going to be talking today about Brave New World, the seminal dystopian novel written in 1931 by Aldous Huxley and published in 1932. So if you have not yet listened to one of our Thoughtcrime Thursdays episodes, Thoughtcrime Thursdays is a reoccurring fixture that we do on the podcast, and in it, we analyze and use dystopian fiction to critique the waking dystopia that is the current world paradigm. You may find other podcast entries in the series by navigating to libertyweekly.net and clicking on the Thoughtcrime Thursdays tab in the left-hand menu bar. And as always, please find the show notes for this episode by navigating to libertyweekly.net/the episode number, which today is episode number 29. Okay, so before we get into Brave New World, I wanted to make a few quick announcements here. So first off, last week we launched our Patreon page, and we already have 2 patrons on that platform here, and I wanted to take this time to thank them specifically, Jacob and Jeff. Thanks so much, you guys, for spending your hard-earned money to help support the show. It really does mean a lot here, and it really does help support what I do and what Jerry does. So thanks to both of you guys. And speaking of Patreon, I'm currently running a launch promotion whereby anyone who pledges to the show before October 1st will also unlock the benefits from the tier above their pledge level. And so, for example, if you pledge $5 per month, you will not only gain access to the Liberty Weekly ANCAP meme repository, you will also gain access to show extras and bloopers, which is normally only available for $10 a month. And this offer is only valid until the end of October, though, when all of the unlocked benefits from the tier above will return to their regular subscription price. And in the way of these benefits, I've been absolutely dumping all of my bonus content on Patreon. There's still a bit to go yet, but I have the next few days off of school. I don't have class till next Wednesday, so I have some time to do that. But currently, at the time of writing this episode, there are 250 Liberty-related memes in the Liberty Weekly meme cache, which is an amount that grows daily. And I've been tagging them so that they're searchable. So if you're arguing with someone on Twitter or social media, you can head over to the meme repository and search for whatever you need to, throw at them. I've also posted the hyperlink transcripts to 3 prior episodes. And if you're asking yourself, Patrick, why would I want the transcripts when I can find the show notes by navigating to libertyweekly.net/the episode number? And my answer to that is, well, if you are short on time, the transcripts include literally everything I'm saying right now written out, only with more specific and hyperlinked citations that are linked to their corresponding assertions. And additionally, if you detest my folksy Wisconsin accent, you don't even have to hear my voice, so there's that. In all seriousness, though, I've been very excited by the possibilities that Patreon unlocks for us and what I've already been able to offer with it so far. But ultimately, I'm hoping that all you listeners will give it a try and begin to enjoy a more intimate connection to the show. And finally, I've decided to forego the McNuke level reward offering of having a regularly scheduled guest appearance on the show. And that's just because we often invite listeners and other content producers to appear with us on the show. And in hindsight, I thought it might somehow cheapen the experience by selling appearances on the show. And I don't really want to do that. It just doesn't sound ideal. So I'm still thinking of the ultimate $100 per month subscription bonus, but I don't think we'll have to worry about that anytime soon. But to wrap that section up, if you value what we do here at the show, and if you prefer the finer things in life, become a patron of the show and enjoy the enhanced Liberty Weekly experience. You can do that by navigating to patreon.com/Liberty Weekly. And lastly, thanks for hanging in there. I made a geometric polygon design of the famous Murray Rothbard portrait and made a better Enemy of the State style t-shirt. You know, the one that the Mises Institute always has. And the reason I did this was because I got one of those t-shirts from the Mises Institute, and the shirt itself was not of very high quality, and it shrunk in the wash, and there was nothing on the back either. And my design has a super sleek modern look. The logo is bigger than on the regular t-shirts, and it's printed on a high quality t-shirt, one that won't shrink. And it says Enemy of the State on it, and on the back it has the quote, "The greatest danger to the state is independent intellectual criticism," from Murray Rothbard, which is pretty cool. I always like it when t-shirts have stuff on the back. But it also comes in lots of different colors that you can choose. But make sure that you order yours before the first shipment goes out on Tuesday, September 5th, because I'm doing it through Teespring. But you can find it by following the link in the show notes page or by navigating to teespring.com/Murray Rothbard, and that's one word. Okay, so I know that was a lot of announcements. Thanks for hanging in there. Without further ado, let's dive into the show. So in my mind, there exists a triumvirate of seminal 20th century dystopian novels. In chronological order, they are Huxley's Brave New World, Orwell's 1984, and Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. And ultimately, while each of these works are apt and very correct in identifying worrying trends, they each present a distinct vision of the future, and in my opinion, some of the 3 are more correct than others. But Orwell presents a bleak and overtly authoritarian vision of the future that is most likely influenced by the horrors of both the Nazi and Soviet regimes, while at the same time Brave New World and Fahrenheit 451 highlight this kind of passive authoritarianism, which is an insight that I think more accurately predicted our current predicament. While elements of this passive authoritarianism are nonetheless present in 1984, Ingsoc rules a bleak and dismal society with brute force, and on the other hand, the totalitarianism of the globalist world state that exists in Brave New World, and the regime, I forget what it's called, in Fahrenheit 451, is aided in their rule by a barrage of social engineering meant to pacify and detract the populace from bigger ideas. And even detracting from the other two novels, Brave New World presents what Professor Berzer in the Tom Woods Liberty Classroom calls a kind of sterile, gentleman's dystopia, one that was imagined before the true evils of 20th century totalitarianism really became known throughout the West. And that's really the vision that Huxley presents, being himself a gentleman, and maybe what we might call a bit of a New World Order insider. Ultimately, Huxley is a very interesting and hard creature to pin down. But again, to aid me in that quest of trying to pin down just what Huxley is, I'm going to call upon a few sources. One is Brave New World Revisited, the book itself. 2 is Liberty Classroom, and 3 is the Corbett Report. So I learned from Berzer in Liberty Classroom that Orwell, who was ironically a student and later a critic of Huxley, classified Huxley as being composed of a bizarre mixture of radicalism, Catholicism, humanism, conservatism, pacifism, and anarchism. So yeah, try to wrap your head around that one. But so given that frame, let us not forget that Huxley himself comes from a very well-established British family. His great-grandfather, Tedx Huxley, was a famous evolutionary biologist and naturalist, and his great-uncle, Matthew Arnold, was an equally notable poet and cultural critic. As a side note, perhaps it is Huxley's upbringing within this British aristocracy that bleeds into Brave New World's regimented caste system. But at the same time, we need to remember that Huxley is almost equally famous for writing Brave New World as he is for penning The Doors of Perception, which was one of the first mainstream works promoting the use of psychedelic drugs. So yeah, Huxley is kind of a bit of a posh British insider who also had a penchant for mescaline and LSD. But turning from Berzer to Brave New World Revisited, specifically to the introduction written by Christopher Hitchens, we see that despite his pedigree, it would not be fair to say that Huxley's life was a proverbial walk in the park. To quote Hitchens, Huxley was never at all impoverished as a boy, but his mother died of cancer when he was 14, and his brother committed suicide 2 years later. And as if that weren't enough, Huxley's dreams of becoming a doctor were dashed when he contracted an eye infection that left his sight substantially impaired after blinding him from ages 17 to 20. But despite these setbacks, Huxley was very well read, commanding among many things a vast knowledge of French culture and a keen interest in the work of Hellenic thinker Pyrrho, who, and I'm quoting Hitchens again, quote, argued that judgment be suspended on any matter concerning the truth. Every position may be held to be equally right as well as equally wrong. So basically, this results in Huxley satirically contradicting himself throughout Brave New World. And ultimately, I think that there's no understanding Brave New World or Huxley's other works without understanding these contradictions and also Pyrrho's viewpoint. For instance, the linchpin of Huxley's dystopian and utopian works is the use of drugs in society. The logical conundrum here being that, despite Huxley's advocacy of hallucinogenics as being the key to meaningfully expanding human consciousness, drugs are simultaneously the main mechanism of state totalitarianism in Brave New World. More specifically, instead of using drugs to reach a higher consciousness, the regime in Brave New World uses soma to lull the populace into forgetting about anything that really matters. And of course, this is different from both 1984, where Ingsoc blatantly manipulates the past, and from Fahrenheit 451, where the people themselves decide to both erase and forget the past. Now, there are many, many things that I could offer as evidence in this podcast in discussing these little Huxleyan logical idiosyncrasies within Brave New World. And in fact, I've written out a whole list here, but I really wanted to use the rest of the show to key into both these ideas of the role of drugs in society and the corresponding idea of passive and overt authoritarian totalitarianism. Now, regarding the role of drugs in society, I happened by pure serendipitous chance to come across Graham Hancock's banned TED Talk lecture the other day entitled The War on Consciousness. And for those of you who don't know who Graham Hancock is, I will link to both his website's bio page and his Wikipedia page, the latter of which is decidedly hostile. But basically, Graham Hancock is a very famous author and journalist who describes himself as, quote, an unconventional thinker who raises controversial questions about humanity's past. And at times he has, I think, unfairly been lumped into the whole ancient aliens crowd, but I don't really believe he thinks that aliens visited humans in the distant past. I think that his assertion is merely that there is a great forgotten chapter in human history, and that human civilization was in fact much older and more advanced than the mainstream consensus. One thing he often says is that we are a species with amnesia. But in addition to his work regarding forgotten chapters of human history, Hancock is a staunch advocate of psychedelic drugs to be used strictly for spiritual purposes. And this leads me back to the subject of his band TED Talk. So I'm going to play a bit here, but I would urge the audience to go check out the full 20 minutes in full of the talk. But like I said, I'll play a few bookend snippets of the TED Talk itself as a fair use.
After 6 million years of boredom, the evolutionary ascent of our species from the last common ancestor with the chimpanzee, something extraordinary happened to us less than 100,000 years ago, which, by the way, is long after we'd become anatomically modern. It was a kind of emergence into consciousness less than 100,000 years ago, really less than 40,000 years ago, when we became fully symbolic creatures. And this great change has been defined as the single most important step forward in the evolution of human behavior, is intimately associated with the emergence of the great and transcendent rock and cave art all around the world. And over the last 30 years, researchers led by Professor David Lewis Williams at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa and many others have suggested an intriguing and radical possibility, which is that this emergence into consciousness was triggered by our ancestors' encounters with visionary plants and the beginning of shamanism. If you analyze the cave art, there's not time to go into the details here, but there are so many details that make it clear that this was an art of altered states of consciousness, of visions, and that plants like the Amanita muscaria mushroom or psilocybin mushrooms appear to have been directly connected with this sudden and radical change. And it's not as though our society is opposed in principle to altered states of consciousness. I mean, billions are being made by the unholy alliance of psychiatrists and big pharma in overprescribing drugs to control so-called syndromes like depression or attention deficit disorder in teenagers. And we have a love affair in our society with alcohol. We glorify this most boring of drugs, despite the terrible consequences that it often has. And of course, we love our stimulants, our tea, our coffee, our energy drinks, our sugar, and huge industries are built around these substances, which are valued because of the way they alter consciousness. But what all these approved altered states of consciousness have in common is that none of them contradict or conflict with the basic state of consciousness valued by our society, which I would call the alert, problem-solving state of consciousness, which is good for the more mundane aspects of science. It's good for the prosecution of warfare. It's good for commerce. It's good for politics. But I think everybody realizes that the promise of a society over-monopolistically based upon this state of consciousness has proved hollow, and that this model is no longer working, that it's broken in every possible sense that a model can be broken, and that urgently we need to find something to replace it. And I stand here invoking the hard-won right of freedom of speech to call for and demand another right to be recognized, and that is the right of adult sovereignty over consciousness. There's a war on consciousness in our society, and if we as adults are not allowed to make sovereign decisions about what to experience with our own consciousness while doing no harm to others, including the decision to use responsibly ancient and sacred visionary plants, then we cannot claim to be free in any way, and it's useless for our society to go around the world imposing our form of democracy on others while we nourish this rot at the heart of society and we do not allow individual freedom over consciousness. It may even be that we're denying ourselves the next vital step in our own evolution by allowing this state of affairs to continue, and who knows, perhaps our immortal destiny as well. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
So through this TED Talk, we get Graham Hancock's somewhat controversial view that mankind's emergence into consciousness was instigated through the use of hallucinogenic drugs. And this view is known generally as the stoned ape theory. And I'll link in the show notes page to the Wikipedia page that explains that theory. And throughout the rest of the lecture, Hancock recounts his own experience with and study of ayahuasca, or DMT, and its enormous healing potential. And he talks a lot about the use of it in treatment of serious psychological problems, including addiction. But more importantly, he weaves his personal story of healing in with the overarching assertion that hallucinogenics have a very important role to play in the human experience, and in our desire to connect with something bigger than ourselves. Of course, as we have heard, he asserts that there has been a state and commercially sponsored war on this idea. Now, I'm not here to try and convince the audience of the morality of using these drugs. I personally have never used any hallucinogenic drugs, but I tend to agree with Hancock's take on them, and ultimately, Hancock's points are very apt within the framework that Huxley has set out for us in this episode. If the stoned ape theory is in fact correct, and we as humans owe our emergence into consciousness to the use of psychedelic drugs, wouldn't it stand to reason that the use of these drugs explicitly for purposes of spiritual healing and insight is an altogether healthy and scientifically progressive thing? One interesting thing that I think Hancock notes is that psychedelic drug use is actually very common throughout antiquity and in native cultures. You know, think of things like peyote for southwestern Native Americans or ayahuasca in Peru. But moreover, Hancock asserts that our stigma against psychedelic experiences is decidedly modern. So instead of using these drugs to heal ourselves through expanding our consciousness, we have the sad inversion of these healing medicines being corrupted in a Frankenstein caricature of their true potential for good. And this is happening through state-sanctioned monopolies. And these monopolies are corrupting the true healing powers of these drugs while simultaneously using their corporatist power to normalize and push their abusive use and overprescription through big pharma. And as Hancock stated, think of things like Ritalin, Adderall, antidepressant, opiates, etc. And these are marketed because they either produce a productive, wakeful, or attentive state, or because they make the users drop down and out. And so these drugs are either peddled through big pharma or through the CIA running the American drug trade, through drug cartels and front organizations. And at the same time that all these other drugs are being pushed, psychedelics and other drugs that expand consciousness when used correctly are more stigmatized and not as actively pushed, either through big pharma or through the CIA drug trade. And for more of the absolutely horrific effects of the quote-unquote war on drugs, I'm sure this crowd, doesn't need more evidence, but I pulled some statistics anyways that you can find in the show notes page and in our episode transcript for Patreon subscribers. And that is that from 2002 to 2015, according to government statistics from drugabuse.org, overdose deaths in the United States have increased 2.2 times. It's just absolutely disgusting. But to bring us back around, in Brave New World, we see soma as producing a euphoric bliss without any side effects. And this is weaponized, like the CIA absolutely pumping opiates into the country through front organizations. But where I think Brave New World departs from the reality of our current situation is that in the story, soma is used mainly to aid in social engineering, And while social engineering is a large part of what the war on drugs is about, the cyclical nature of the deep state's operations is a tad more complex than what is presented in Brave New World. So to this point in the episode, I've talked about how psychedelics have been suppressed by modern regimes to prevent free exploration of consciousness and the subsequent questioning of narratives. But I wanted to temper my position by pointing out how governments have also used psychedelics for evil purposes, like social engineering. And to preface this point, I'm going to hand the reins off to Mr. James Corbett of the Corbett Report.
You mentioned Edward Bernays. Is Aldous Huxley one of the people who is operating in this field of social engineering?
Aldous Huxley was certainly connected to the field of social engineering through his family connections and the milieu in which he was raised. I don't believe that he himself was a social engineer per se.
Okay.
I think he certainly had an effect on the culture through, of course, Brave New World, which is his best known work, but also through his advocacy for psychedelic experience. In the 1950s and 60s, towards the end of his life, he became an advocate for psychedelic experience and was one of the people who was behind the flowering of the 1960s and the drug movement and all of that, which of course was also a CIA-sponsored counterculture, which was fostered into existence, I think, precisely for the purpose of manipulating the organized habits and opinions of the masses. So I think he certainly had connections and inroads and insights into that group, and to a certain extent, I guess you could say he was a social engineer of a type, because he did have some importance as a well-recognized writer. Although I don't think he saw himself necessarily that way. I think he more saw himself as someone who was observing this phenomenon and commenting on this phenomenon, which he did so quite explicitly, and not only in his works like Brave New World, but also in some of the speeches that he gave. And I always point back to one that he gave towards the very end of his life in 1962, just the year before he died. He gave a speech at Berkeley in which he basically outlined the remarkable progress that was being made at that time towards the scientific control of people in that type of mind control, that sci-fi mind control type situation that I talked about earlier, where we were talking about, a remote control to move people around as if they were robots. He was actually talking about experiments of, for example, electrodes being implanted in people's brains that could make they could deliver shocks that would make people feel certain sensations, feel certain emotions, etc. And he was quite, you could tell he was evidently, immensely interested, we'll say, in those types of technologies and their political implications. And he spelt it out quite clearly, I think, by saying that obviously the dictators of the future are going to delight in making people actually to desire their own servitude. Which it seems so ridiculous when it's presented to someone without any context. But when you start to see the ways that not only drugs or electrodes in the brain or other such technologies can produce those effects, but by the ways that propaganda itself can produce the effect of making people actually desiring their own servitude, it's quite an amazing phenomenon, and one that Huxley was definitely involved in documenting.
When you mentioned that Huxley was also promoting drugs, is that a way of setting up a controlled opposition?
I think that had something to do with it. I think that there's also there was certainly an attempt to detach the counterculture, which I think was understood would develop around the anti-Vietnam War movement, to spin it into politically ineffective fields, so that it became it became more about dropping out and tuning in and all of that. The Timothy Leary catchphrase, rather than actually engaging with the system in a meaningful way. And so I think there was an attempt to undermine that, but it was spread even before the Vietnam War officially started. Of course, the Vietnam War had been ongoing as more of an intelligence operation since the 1950s, but even before the actual real military operations began in earnest, I think that the CIA was already actively involved with this, and the CIA's involvement with LSD had already developed through their MK Ultra experiments into trying to to find truth serums that they could use to deliver to the enemy, or mind control substances that they could use to create a Manchurian candidate. So, for example, capturing an enemy and making him do your bidding would be, a dream of any intelligence agency. So they were actively at work on that and using such things as LSD as possibilities for that. They found it was not very effective at all as a truth serum or as a way of controlling people to that extent, but it was certainly a good way of getting people basically shunted off into completely different areas of experience that didn't affect them politically. And I think that they jumped on that bandwagon as a way of trying to divert what was going on. And there were a lot of organizations that were behind this, not only the CIA, but the Esalen Institute and others that deserve looking into. But I think that was the 1960s counterculture to a large extent was pioneered and pushed in certain directions by the U.S. intelligence apparatus.
So through Corbett's commentary on the psychedelics issue, we get two different viewpoints. We can see that while Graham Hancock has highlighted the healing powers of psychedelics, the CIA has also used psychedelics to disrupt and detract the anti-Vietnam movement, and I'm sure there's many other instances in which they've used it. We know that LSD has been used in military experiments and been given to, in fact, there's famous Supreme Court cases about members of the military being given without their consent LSD to test whether they can use it in interrogation and stuff like that. But likewise, Hancock accounts how dark and violent cultures have used psychedelics to aid in the commission of great atrocities. Let's hear a little more about that.
I agree with you that the single one-stop shop to transform our society and make it a better place, a far better place than it can be today, is the correct use of psychedelics. But I would be wrong to say that psychedelics are a magic potion, because they're not. And there have been societies which have misused psychedelics profoundly. I would say that the Aztecs in Mexico were one of those.
What did they do?
Well, they used psilocybin, but they did not use it for gentle consciousness exploration. The Aztecs used psilocybin preparatory to rituals of human sacrifice. The Aztecs used psilocybin as a vehicle to communicate with their deities, and those deities included characters like Huitzilopochtli, who was the war god, who spoke to Montezuma was the last Aztec emperor, and that's 1519. When Cortez appears in Mexico, and Montezuma was in daily communication with the war god by means of psilocybin mushrooms. And what the war god was telling him to do, there's demons out there as well as angels. What the war god was telling him to do was to kill people and to stretch them over a stone and cut out their hearts. And there was a horrendous situation in Tenochtitlan, which was the capital city, which is now Mexico City, as a matter of fact, when they inaugurated the Great Pyramid. Reliable accounts, 80,000 people were sacrificed to the god of war.
In 4 days.
In 4 days. 80,000 people. Now, this is a bloody awful thing that was going on there, and psychedelics were involved. I'm not saying that psychedelics caused it. And again, we come to this issue. Are these entities that we encounter projections of our own minds? Or is there some other realm or level of existence where non-physical entities that communicate with us at the level of consciousness exist? Whichever it is, whether it's a projection of our own minds, as you rightly say, or whether those entities are real, is less important than the effects on our behavior. But if what is being projected from our own mind is very dark and negative and wicked, or if those entities also include evil angels as well as good guys, then you can get cultures misled down this path, and I do believe that's what happened with the Aztec.
So ultimately, I think that Brave New World gives us a unique insight into the role of drugs in society, and I think that it does that in a way that is unique to any other major dystopian novel. But moreover, while I think that each of the three novels in the triumvirate that I keep talking about, I think each one brings their own fundamental insights to the table. But if I really had to pick a, quote, most correct one, it would either be Brave New World or Fahrenheit 451, especially through Fahrenheit 451, the role that the people themselves played in self-censorship and getting rid of these ideas. And that's because the whole distracting and conditioning people to love their servitude part that Corbett highlights is a huge theme that I see within our current world paradigm. And I think I bounce between Brave New World and Fahrenheit 451 because they both present their own mixture of that. In Brave New World, it is more state-sanctioned, but also the people are complacent in it. While in Fahrenheit 451, it is state-sanctioned, but one of the main mechanisms is the public consensus and the willingness to censor themselves and each other. But moreover, I have a different idea as to why Fahrenheit 451 and Brave New World are more correct than 1984. And to support this idea, I have some anecdotal evidence. I think that an overly brutal, violent, and oppressive totalitarian regime is not efficient. It requires a lot of manpower, and I don't think that it would secure the active support of the populace unless there's a favored group or something like that. At least I don't think it would work for the long haul. I think that with 1984, there will be a breaking point where either the regime will fail for financial instability or that the pure brutality will elicit a desperate, cornered rat type of reaction in the populace. But in order to create a soft totalitarian or authoritarian society, you ultimately need to get people to love their servitude and simultaneously believe that it is not servitude. And I think that because 1984 is so overtly brutal, that the reality of it is too overt to be ignored. And I say this despite the fact that at the end of 1984, the whole point of the book is that Winston realizes that he loves Big Brother and that he doesn't get it. So unless I'm completely missing the point of 1984, which is very possible, but as one last little piece of anecdotal evidence, I'm going to offer a point that Michael Malice often makes about North Korea. So in North Korea, we have the propaganda there, and we have the brutality of the regime, and we have the complete surveillance state. But ultimately, the North Korean people know when there is less food on the table than the year before. And I think through that process of realizing that, despite all these things and despite the conditioning, our lives are not improving. And therefore, one way or another, I would assert that with overt brutality, the state's illusion will eventually fall. And I think that 1984 is simply unbelievable because the regime is so brutal that it just wouldn't be sustainable one way or another. People would realize, things are not going well. All right, so to recap, in this episode we talked about Brave New World generally, and then keyed in on a specific theme within the book, that of psychedelic drug use in society. And I hope that I was able to frame the issue and present a few compelling points. And then in the end, we came back to the three triumvirate novels here, and I kind of explained why I prefer the vision I think the vision in Brave New World and in Fahrenheit 451 are a little more accurate than 1984, even though in 1984, I'll concede that there are a lot of things that are very, very much correct, like ignorance is strength, doublespeak, all of the conditioning and the propaganda sphere. I think that is completely apt. But that soft totalitarian part, that soft authoritarianism part, I think is more real and more widespread and is better encompassed in Brave New World and Fahrenheit 451. But I wanted to make this point just in closing here that to aid in my introduction of Huxley and Brave New World, I gave the audience a tiny little taste of what awaits listeners in Liberty Classroom, but I didn't really want to source too much info from the lessons there for fear of divulging what is paywall. So if you like info pack episodes like this and the ones that I've been doing lately, I would urge you all to discover the world of Liberty Classroom by signing up through our affiliate link by navigating to libertyweekly.net/Liberty Classroom. And I have found tremendous value there myself through the program, and I think that you will too. Plus, 50% of your subscription fee will go towards supporting this show. So that will improve your experience both here, and you will be gaining the insight of Liberty Classroom itself. So as always, a few housekeeping things. I would urge all of our listeners to sign up for our email list. Doing so will get you 2 info-packed ebooks on the minimum wage and the war on drugs. So we were talking about the war on drugs today. You can get, the whole bite of the pie by signing up for our email list and getting my ebook, which is a research paper that I did for law school on the war on drugs. To sign up for the email list, you can do so by following the link in the show notes page at libertyweekly.net/29, or by navigating to our website anyways, in which case you will find an email sign-up option on the page. But as I stated at the beginning of the episode, through the end of September, for less than the price of one Chipotle burrito, millennials, I know you can support our work on Patreon and in return gain access to a bunch of show extras, hyperlinked transcripts, and access to our vast ANCAP meme repository that is searchable with tags. Probably something you won't get anywhere else. But also don't forget to check out that geometric polygon design on the classic Murray Rothbard Enemy of the State t-shirt. I think that everyone should have one. This is the best design that I've seen. I'm not just saying this because I made it, but I made it because I really wanted a really cool Rothbard Enemy of the State t-shirt, and so I just went out and made it, and now I'm making it available to you guys. And so I would urge you to check that out by navigating to teespring.com/Murray Rothbard. But more important than any of those things that I've mentioned, the email list, Patreon, or the Murray Rothbard shirt, I have a task for everyone in the audience this week. I challenge you, after you get your Patreon access, to tell 2 friends about the Liberty Weekly podcast and to link them to the show. And I do this because podcasts spread primarily through word of mouth, and the more people that we are able to reach with solid Liberty-related content, the better off it will be for all of us and the Liberty movement in general. So I know there's about 150 people that listen to each episode of this show within the first week. If each of you tell 2 friends, bam, that's a huge audience increase. So that's your assignment. Thanks everyone for joining me once again. Thanks for your attention and your support. Signing off.